Welcome! I am so excited you are joining me to learn more about Diastasis Recti. Whether you're doing my free beginners program, one of my other programs, or simply hanging out with me in my Facebook group, Diastasis Recti Workout Support, or on my YouTube channel, Facebook page, or Instagram under the Core Fitness for Mums, there are always certain terms that I talk about. So, what I wanted to do today is to go through and explain what these are and how they impact your diastasis recti. So, one of the most common terms you will see with diastasis recti is doming, or it's sometimes called tenting. And what that is down this center line here, you can see how this lady has domed. So it's right down the center line. You can just see it. It comes up into a kind of a peak, which is why it's sometimes called tenting, because it kind of looks like a triangle of a tent. So this indicates that you definitely have diastasis recti because this only happens with diastasis. It means that your TVAs haven't been, or your transverse abdominis, sorry, haven't been engaged or are too weak to do whatever movement you are currently doing. And when your rectus abdominis, so these are the six pack abs that come down in the front of your abdominal wall, when they come together, your connective tissue isn't being stretched, which is what your TVAs do. They put tension in that connective tissue. So, because that hasn't been stretched, it causes this doming to happen when you lift your head or bend backwards slightly or think about trying to do a chin up or lifting your child up and you're putting that pressure on your abdominal wall. And because of the gap, that doming happens where your connective tissue, instead of being pulled tight, it goes up into a tent like or dome like structure. All right. So if you ever see this happening on your own abdominal wall, then you need to stop that movement that you're doing because that is distorting that linear elbow or that connective tissue and making it weaker. And what we want to do is we want to get that tension happening in there to help pull everything together and flatten your abdominal wall. So the next one I want to talk about is bulging, or some people like to call it bread loafing because it kind of looks like a bread loaf. So here you can see this bread loaf looking abdominal here. And what's happening is, again, your TVAs or your transverse abdominis aren't doing their job and they are more, well, they're weaker than the rest of your core. And what tends to happen is your external obliques, so down the side here, and your rectus abdominis, so this main part, or those six pack abs, are doing all the work. And because your external obliques are so strong, they're pulling in, causing this bread loaf or bulging effect on your abdominal wall. Now, this can happen with or without diastasis recti. So you may see people who don't have diastasis actually bulging. And what that means is there's an imbalance in your core, and your TVAs are not as strong as your outer abdominals, so your rectus abdominis and your external obliques, and that causes this bulging to happen. Now, if you have diastasis, this is really bad because this bulging is putting pressure out onto your diastasis, causing that gap to widen and meaning that you're not going to allow it to come back together and strengthen. Okay, so again, any movements that cause the bulging is something that you don't want to be doing. Now, I see this so often with even fitness instructors, if you're watching some of the videos where they're doing double leg lifts. So, a lot of whether it be the Pilates where they lift their heads and they do the 100s or double leg lifts. So, anything that puts a lot of pressure on your abdominal wall, if your TVAs aren't strong enough, that's when that bulging or bread loafing happens. So we want to stop that until you've rebalanced your core. Okay, sinking. So this is kind of the opposite of doming. And again, it happens when your TVAs aren't strong enough to control what's happening in your deep core system. So sinking, I tend to see this happening when your erectus abdominis, so again, these six-pack abs here, uh, come together. So when you do a crunch or a head lift, that brings your rectus abdominis together. When you do a TVA exercise, that stretches the linear elbow, that connective tissue, across the gap. So when you engage your TVAs, your gap may actually widen, but it should be firmer. So if you're pressing into it, that means it's going to be firmer under your fingers. And if you didn't engage your TVAs, your fingers might sink further in with little resistance. So, what tends to happen with sinking is people either hold their breath, so they do something like a head lift and they hold their breath and suck up under their rib cage whilst holding their breath, causing that sinking to happen, or their rectus abdominis are really dominant and strong and they come together, allowing the sinking to happen because there is absolutely no deep core system firing. So, again, something that you're wanting to look out for, if you see it happening, you need to stop. Think about your alignment, think about your breathing. Are you breathing throughout the exercise, or are you holding your breath at the hard point of the exercise? And when you hold your breath, your pressure system goes, and that is what can cause prolapse, pelvic floor issues, hernias, and worsen your diastasis. Okay, so no holding your breath. Don't allow the sinking to happen. We're aiming for this part here to get some nice tension in it, and that is what will work your core so that it regains its function. All right, bearing down. So you will hear this so much. Don't bear down. And what tends to happen when you bear down is you get this bulge here. Okay. Now, when you engage your TVAs and you're doing, say, you're doing the beginners program, and I say, exhale and engage your TVAs. Your exhale should come pretty much, should feel like it's coming from your pelvic floor up. Whereas a lot of people, when they exhale, they grip their ribs down and they exhale, pushing the air this way. And when you push the air this way, your lower abdominals will get bigger and you get this bulge here. And what's happening is you're actually bearing down onto your pelvic floor. And here again, you run the risk of incontinence, so leaking, or a prolapse, which might happen later on. Prolapse doesn't just happen straight after giving birth. More and more people are getting prolapse at 10 months postpartum because they never strengthen their core, and that includes your pelvic floor, correctly. Then at about 10 months, either their child has got that much heavier, so when they lift, it's more effort and they bear down, and that's what causes it, or they're like at that point where, nope, now I need to lose my baby weight, and off they go and hit the gym or go running, and that cardio, high impact exercise, and they're breathing where they're bearing down and they never strengthen their pelvic floor, causes the prolapse to happen. So it's so important to retrain your core and your breathing before you start that high impact, especially repetitive impact exercising like running. So bearing down. So when you're doing these exercises like the TVAs and the heel slides, try and watch from a side on view and check, am I increasing this bulge here, or is it flattening when I engage my TVAs? Because that's what you're wanting to do. You want to exhale and flatten this area, so whilst you're doing your exercises, versus letting it bulge up like this. Okay, so bulging in this area, so just around your pant line, um, normally equals you're bearing down on your pelvic floor, and that can cause issues, if not now, later on. Okay, now that we've gone through the general terms that you hear with diastasis, so that's the doming, the bulging, the sinking, and the bearing down, let's have a look at some of the things that you might not hear quite as commonly in other diastasis recti programs, but something that I work on a whole lot in the foundational program and some of my other diastasis programs. So I'm looking at your rib angle. So when you go through pregnancy, so that the baby has room to grow and get bigger, our rib cages actually widen out, okay? Especially in that later stage of pregnancy where, you know, you're exhausted and the baby seems so high up and there's no way you feel like you can even breathe. That's because that baby is right up under your diaphragm and they're pushing out on your rib cage to get some room. Now, generally, after you've given birth and your uterus all contracts down, your rib cage will come back to its normal 90 degrees. But for a lot of people, it doesn't always come all the way back to that normal 90 degrees. Often, one side of your rib cage may be flared out wider as well because you have a tendency to carry a child on one side and that flares out the other side. So, there are a couple of things that can be happening here. So, one, your rib cage might not come back down, or two, your habits or your daily activities on how you lift, you carry, you walk, you stand can cause that rib cage to not come back down or to come back down unevenly. So, why is this so important? Well, let's just have a look here. If you have a good 90-degree rib cage happening, your muscles are supported and come in. Okay, so imagine down here is your rectus abdominis, and this is your gap or your diastasis here. Now, see how this is supported in a nice way? Every time you breathe, your diaphragm's going to come down and push down. And then as you exhale, it's all going to come back in, and your rib cage is going to come down, and everything's going to be pushed or brought inwards, which is what we want to support a diastasis. When your rib cage is flared, so like this, those muscles now aren't supported, and the gap here, you said this is your diastasis, isn't supported. And this is why when you have a flared rib cage, you have a much larger belly that happens. There's not as much support bringing everything together and in. And that's why often people say, I don't understand. I've lost all my pregnancy weight. I'm down to what I was pre pregnancy, but I still have this belly that comes out. Well, if your rib cage is open, it's not supporting your rectus abdominis muscles, your external obliques aren't getting as well working, your diaphragm isn't supported for breathing down, going down on the inhale and coming back up on the exhale. So your whole core isn't firing correctly. And this then causes a lot of imbalance and that stomach to come out. So it is so important to get it back in. Now, people say to me, can a chiropractor help me with this? Yes, they can often bring in your rib cage, but if your breathing and how you load your core hasn't changed, so let's just say you're a true belly breather or you have a really shallow breathing pattern, your chiropractor is going to bring your rib cage back in, and then you're going to walk out the door, sit in your car, go back to that belly breathing, and push out your rib cage again. So you need to retrain your body on how to breathe using your ribs, a good expansion breath, and bring everything together. So a chiropractor can help, but if you haven't fixed your underlying issues, which is what we go through in the Diastasis Foundational Program, and the exercises to maintain that rib cage angle as well as strengthen the muscles around it to hold your rib cage in the right place, then you might be just going back to that chiropractor every week to realign yourself. Okay? So, yes, go for it, get it fixed, but also work on your breathing and the muscles to support your rib cage coming in and your diaphragm working correctly. Okay, so we're still working with our ribs here. So what we just talked about is your rib cage angle being wide and not supporting your diastasis and your diaphragm. But what can also happen is, this is so common if in a prior life or still you tend to suck in your belly button, your ribs might also be flared forward. And so you can see here how the rib cage is flared forward. You can even tell from the bra line that it's flared up and forward. And now imagine with an anterior pelvic tilt, so if it's coming down, literally you're just letting your whole belly hang out because you are not supporting yourself. So what tends to happen with this is people are shallow breathers, so they breathe all chest. So there's no rib expansion, there's no back expansion. Your chest and shoulders go just up and down. And this can cause a lot of neck pain, a whole lot of upper back pain. So if you have upper back pain or stiffness or neck stiffness, this is probably you. So what we want to do is we want to bring your ribs down so that it's not opening your gap with every breath that you take, and you want to align your pelvis. Now, when those two are sitting on top of each other exactly, then everything is supported for your core to fire correctly. Your diaphragm will push down onto your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor will contract up and bring your diaphragm up. Your ribs will go out and in as they're meant to. Your back will feel amazing because when you breathe or you do a really good inhale, your back will be able to relax. And what tends to happen then is your hip flexors or your psoas muscle especially will also relax because you've taken the tension off it with your inhale. Whereas when you are a rib flarer and your back is doing a lot of the work because your core isn't, then your hip flexors will get tighter and tighter and tighter, causing you to tilt your pelvis into an anterior tilt. So that's when it will go down this way, um, and your back will get tight, your lower back will get sore. When you lift something, you'll feel it in your back. So breathing is so key for allowing your neck and your back to relax so that you stop some of that pain that you're happening. Now, here's another example. See this hinge point just here? So it's not a lower arch, which a lot of people have, and that lower arch is more indicative of a anterior pelvic tilt and tight hip flexors. This high hinge point here, that tends to be indicative of somebody who doesn't get any back expansion when they breathe. And when you don't get back expansion when you breathe, that's when your upper back gets really tight and your back does too much work, which means your abs aren't doing any. And that imbalance causes a lot of upper back pain, neck and shoulder pain. And it also means that because your back is being pulled all the time, your core is in an incorrect alignment for you to be able to help your diastasis come together and have your core fire correctly. Okay, so have a look at and see whether you've got a high hinge point. And if you have a high hinge point or flared ribs like this or wide ribs, really think about investing in that foundational Diastasis Recti program because we go through all sorts of exercises to help this and also a whole load of stretches to help that upper back feel great again. All right, moving on. We talked a little bit about this, and this is the ab gripping or the rib gripping. So this one's really interesting. I see it most often in people who were fit prior to being pregnant, and they're really used to using their rectus abdominis, so that six-pack abs. And they used to do a whole load of crunches. It's nearly always the crunches that did it. And you're so strong and you're so used to that naturally you start using your rectus abdominis to grip your ribs down. So previously we saw the flared ribs, which let everything just hang out. But a lot of people, what they do to correct that is they grip their ribs down. And so what that does is it flattens this upper part of your belly, but because you're gripping your ribs down, you're causing downward pressure. Remember how we talked about bearing down earlier? So what happens when you do this is you get this lower belly pooch because you put pressure down. And where's that going to go? It's going to push out your lower belly, and nobody wants that sticking out, and pressure on your pelvic floor. And we've talked about this before. Too much pressure on your pelvic floor can cause it to weaken. That can cause leaking. It can cause prolapse. So we do not want to grip our ribs down. We want to learn to bring our ribs down through our breathing, not forcing them down with our muscles. So if you ever hear me say, you're gripping your ribs down, that's what's happening. And that is causing a lower belly pooch and pressure down on your pelvic floor. And we don't want that. You need to learn to breathe correctly to bring your ribs down naturally. All right, so let's just have a quick look at a case study of somebody here because I want to show you what can happen. They all seem like such little subtle things, but by bringing everything together, you can then start really working on your diastasis. So this person was complaining that they weren't able to engage their TVAs very well. So we had a quick look. And let's have a check here. So you can see that this rib angle is really good, but this one's really wide. So they have what's called a one-sided rib flare. And let's have a check. The hip bones aren't even either. And so what tends to happen is that people may carry a child on one side, and when you carry, it's a weird one, and it's so interesting. When you carry on this side, often these obliques over this side get stronger, and these obliques get weaker. And when there are obliques over this side get weaker, your ribs will get wider on this side. Sometimes it happens that people carry on this side and it's a complete hip alignment issue because they've sunken into one hip so often they've put their hips out. So it kind of depends where the problem stems from. Sometimes it's from the top, from the ribs and the external obliques, and sometimes it's from the hips and the hip placement. And if it's the hips, then the hip flexor release program goes through every single muscle in that surrounds your hips. So your glutes, your glute medius, your inner thighs, your outer thighs, like all around that, all your hip flexor muscles, because it's multiple hip flexor muscles. And it works out where all your imbalances are and then gives you a program to fix your imbalances in your hips, to realign your pelvis. And then that, if you need to realign your pelvis, will allow for your hips to realign, which then brings your ribs back in line. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's your breathing, which is an issue with your ribs and your everyday activities, such as holding. So it kind of depends on whether your issue is top down or bottom up, but both need to align in order to help fix your diastasis. So if you have a look at what happened, if we drew a line up her center, because this rib is flared out, her diastasis is being pulled this way. Okay, so you can even see her belly button's off center because this rib, every time she's breathing, it's pulling her gap out and open this way, which is pulling everything off balance. So what she needs to do is bring this rib back down so the foundational program works on all the exercises to bring your ribs back into that 90 degrees, works on any rib flaring that there is. And that then, when that's all in alignment, then that allows you to use the core programs, so the beginners or the intermediate or the advanced core work, to strengthen the muscles in the correct place. And that is what's going to help you regain a functional core. If you look at her from side on, you can see that high hinge point because her breathing isn't correct, which is indicative of what's happening with her ribs. She's getting absolutely no back expansion. This is starting to see that her hip flexors are getting tight. So you can see this anterior pelvic tilt happening. So an anterior pelvic tilt is when you are tilted forward on this angle. A posterior pelvic tilt means you're tilted, sort of you're tucking your bum under versus sticking your bum out. It's probably the easiest way to think about this. So this higher hinge point indicates she's getting no back expansion at all. The one-sided rib flare indicates that some of her movements are incorrect. The hips are out of alignment, so there is an imbalance in her hip muscles. And she's letting it all hang out because of this uneven. So we've got no support on our lower diastasis because of the pelvic tilt, and we've got little support on the upper diastasis because of this hinge point and the breathing and the open ribs. So bringing all that back together and the core work will allow her to help regain a more functional core. And I have one more thing I want to talk to you about, because I want to talk to you about the typical postpartum posture, because this is so important and something that you can fix nearly straight away if you have the right tools. So let's have a look. This person is in such a typical postpartum posture. When we are pregnant, we are belly heavy. And when that happens, we tend to clench our glutes and push our hips forward. So you can see this red line. Her hips are forward of her ankles. So what's happening is, because she is clenching her glutes and pushing her hips forward, her femur, which is the leg bone, is in her hip socket incorrectly. So when she goes to walk or squat or any movements, it's not working in the hip socket correctly. And because that's not working in the hip socket correctly, then you get crunching or clicking or hip pain. And this whole postpartum posture of slinging your hips forward causes back pain, because we end up slinging our hips forward. We get that upper back pain from having to arch our back to not fall forward. So we arch our back, and then so we don't fall backwards, we round the top of our back here, and we have that forward head posture because our body wants to stay upright. So if you sling your hips forward, you try it. Sling your hips forward. Oh, well, I'm going to fall forward. So what you do, you arch your back. Oh, I'm going to fall backwards. So you have to use your head and push yourself forward to stay in balance. So all of this is causing issues again with the diastasis, but worse, it's opening up your pelvic floor and causing issues with your pelvic floor. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to bring our hips back and our head back and in line. So you can see here, these photos were literally about an hour apart. She didn't lose any weight. She didn't do anything else. She didn't strengthen her core work. This isn't a 3-week transformation. This is going through the foundational program and realigning her body so that she brought her hips back. She engaged her TVA slightly in order to support her pelvis in a slightly better alignment. She brought her ribs down slightly. There's still work to do. You can't fix things overnight, for sure, but you can realign yourself. So now her ribs aren't as flared, her head's been brought back in alignment, and in this position, she has the chance of regaining a functional core, because every time she breathes in this position, her core is working correctly, which means it's firing correctly, it's loading correctly. When she lifts, she's not going to hurt her back. And by doing that, we can build the strength in her core, in her back, in her pelvic floor, in her diaphragm in order to regain that functional core. Okay, I hope that this was really useful. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Make sure you find me on Facebook, on Instagram. Please, I will post below some of the programs that I have available. We've talked through a few of them. So we have the foundational program, which really goes through the breathing and the alignment. We have the hip flexor program, which works on any imbalances in the muscles surrounding your hips. So if you have hip pain or one hip is lower than the other, you have SI joint pain, all of those types of things, that program is going to be really useful. There's obviously the free beginners core program. So if you find that your alignment is great, then the core program will help you bring strength back into your muscles, into your TVAs. If you've done the beginners program, there is the Total Core Solution Belly Blast program, which increases the core. So you get the intermediate core work and the advanced core work, along with a weights program to help with your posture. There are bundle packages. So if you want to get a couple of different programs, it will save you money to get some different programs. So I will post that all below, and please subscribe so you can get some of these tips when they get posted, and have a fantastic day.